Thank you everybody for joining us here today, but also yesterday. It was lovely. We really enjoyed the opening and all of you that came to share with us what are the possibilities of the future of architecture if we rethink the relation between the built environment and food systems. And we really enjoyed that you all dive deep into the themes and you asked so many questions. And we do invite you to go back to the exhibition with more time and less people, because there is lots of content to digest. So hopefully you will have the possibility to do that and we can continue our discussion. We're very happy to launch the International Symposium because apart from the projects that they are presented in the exhibition, we do need to have these critical discussions from different people on the work that they have presented in the exhibition, but also on other topics related to the outcome of that work. So we thank you, and we really are looking forward to these 2 days, intense days of discussion. So we will start with a short introduction to our theme, and then we will have some time to get your feedback.
Yes, so on my end, I want to thank you as well. It would not have been possible without each and every one of you. So thank you to the participants, to the speakers, to the Center for Architecture, the wonderful production team. And thank you so much, Claudia, the previous tab curator, for coming to be our keynote speaker. We have so many alliances with the topic and the topic that you have done in 2017. And thank you, Philippe, for coming to be our keynote speaker. We're extremely honored to have all of you here. And just to add a note, my favorite part about yesterday's opening was the fact that during the opening and after the performance, the exhibition was actually eaten. People ate the sausages and the peppers and everything. And we're going to start our introduction to the topic by asking, what is edible? And in our minds, when we consider something edible, we understand it to be eaten, ingested, becoming part of our bodies, so something external becoming an internal process of our body, independently of the taste. So the main question is, what would our relationship to the built environment be like if it would register this process of digestion?
And during the pandemic, we actually found ourselves in front of a main question of where does our food come from? No, we found ourselves in front of empty shelves, and that question became very, very important. And it's not only that question that is actually has been arised by the pandemic, but it was also the fact that this made us reflect on the processes of production, on the processes of transportation, of distribution of goods, and the fragility of these networks. And this is why Edible tries to bring these questions about fragility of networks of production and distribution, and it deals with food in both ways. On the one hand, literal, in a literal way, and on the other hand, in a metaphorical way.
So the literal notion, via food, we explore in the exhibition architectural strategies of local production and self-sufficiency, including urban agriculture systems, renewable energy, and how infrastructures can be reinvented and redesigned to produce food. On the other hand, with the notion of food, we understand waste as food, the byproducts of our living processes, our production systems as food, in ways that limit material loss and explore alternative pathways. So the relationships between architecture and food are interscalar and interterritorial. They connect the stomach and our senses to the ecology of territories and the technology of building systems. They bring together the farm, the stomach, the city, environmental inequality, and
the gut.
Our world, and the gut.
We do know that currently the global food system, and we can see in that image from, and in some images later on, but from the overgrowth of chicken to the entirety of the agri-food industry, it is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. So we need to rethink how we produce our food. And if we need to respond to the increasing urbanization in order to feed our planet for the next 10 to 15 years, we need to triplicate that production. So the ways of where are we doing it and how they become very fundamental for the future of our cities and buildings.
So, I think this one. So we continue to produce and consume our edibles by reinforcing carbon dependency, often unaware of the links between the sourcing, production, and distribution of food, and the ways in which we consume it. In many ways, we are estranged from the journey of the edible arriving to our table.
And if we take the chickens, for example, we will see that from 1957 to 2005, actually the chicken breeds grew about 4 times. So it's not only that we are adapting different kind of food production processes in order to feed our desires, but it's also the fact that we are altering living systems to do so. And that is really striking.
Therefore, in the Biennale, we envision an architecture that produces resources, digests its waste, and decomposes. And a lot of the participants have done a wonderful job in addressing many of these topics. This paradigm radically intervenes and recomposes the extractive, contaminating nature of the built environment and addresses many crises that are interrelated today, namely the public health crisis, social inequity, and the climate crisis, of course. So the idea of a world where the resources are not extracted but recirculated is vital for the future of planetary habitability.
And we have a series of questions that we are raising with this Biennale, but 2 of the most important ones is how we can design the architecture of metabolism, what do we mean by metabolism in architecture, and of course, how can architecture redefine resources, where we find resources, how we use these resources in order to design and build, and how can architecture produce food and eventually be eaten away.
So by eating, we ingest the planet, and then the planet becomes the repository of our excretions. This very primordial relationship of interdependency is sensed via architecture, which becomes the medium where climate change is registered. It basically becomes a medium where resource consumption, decomposition, as well as the body sheltering or macro and macroclimate is registered.
And within our curatorial exhibition, we tried to, let's say, land all these questions and issues into different thematics. And these thematics have been organized around 3 important scales. We're interested to understand the scale, the microscale, the scale of the human cell, the body, but also the microscale of the material, to the mesoscale of habitation and our domestic environments, and of course to the macroscale of the territories and the geopolitics that surround the topic of food and architecture.
Yeah, so we urge all of you to go and look at the exhibition. Yesterday was crazy, so I think that not everybody was able to digest the content. And we're just putting in the slide the different sections that Areti briefly mentioned. The Metabolic Home, where the performance took place, which addresses the scale of habitation of everyday life through a house that becomes, that is consisted out of rooms that address each metabolic process, and resources are recirculated. The microscale of the material from brick to soil, food and geopolitics, the archaeology of architecture and food, and the initiative that we have created in the upper floor, the Future Food Deal, which is consisted of visions and cookbooks. And we will briefly explain each one of these sections.
The Metabolic Home, as we've said, it redefines the concept of habitation. And we actually urge you all, visitors and participants, to become and participate in a curated experiment. The performance that we did last night was a starting point to allow you to understand that you can inhabit that space in different ways. And each of the 7 installations in the Metabolic Home, they represent one domestic space in relation to one process of food. And all these spaces, they interchange, they are interrelated, and they interchange resources among them.
So here you see how we started thinking about the metabolic house. It is consisted of different rooms. So in very few words, food production happens in the garden. Food processing happens in an interspecies kitchen. Consumption, ingestion is hosted in a rewilded dining table. The process of hydration and irrigation happens in a toilet that endlessly recirculates water that then feeds back into the garden. Digestion happens in a lounge, that is where furniture is also becoming part of an envelope that becomes edible. And upcycling is in the garage, which is made out of carbon negative bricks, and breaking nutrients is part of the Access, a staircase made by an Estonian team.
The section from brick to soil, it actually aims to magnify the significance and raise the awareness of the origin, the process, the use, but also the destination of our built matter. With a focus in this micro scale of materials, actually this section, this white section represents a laboratory of experimental solutions for building prototypes and parts that they are, some of them edible, some others upcycled, they are productive or even compostable. And this section is trying to blur the limits between what is nature and what is artifice in the process of building matter. And you will see that most of the participants are actually, they're programming, they are hacking, they are adapting natural processes of growth or harvesting in order to create new building prototypes that they're able to produce food or to be eaten away.
In the large-scale territorial section of food and geopolitics, we engage large-scale territories, planetary phenomena, and bottom-up territorial actions that are presented in this section with maps, drawings, films, visualizations that represent questions of mass migration, food sourcing, especially food sourcing in challenging environmental conditions and zones of conflict. From local ground-up material banks to cultural practices that are rooted in the land and questions of food justice that are brought about by ecological transformations, Food and Geopolitics highlights the interdependencies between food systems, culture, political economy, and geography.
The archaeology of architecture and food systems is something that you can find on the second floor of the exhibition. And it's a thorough research throughout the 20th century that explores the connection of projects around the connections of food and architecture. And it's very important that these kind of projects, they have been researched and presented in a way, in a critical way, where, for example, decolonization of food is happening or should be happening, as well as, as with a critical view on the role of the females within the kitchen and with how houses have been organized around this kind of role of women in the kitchen.
So also in the second floor, you will find an initiative that we did to expand the content of the Biennale, which we have titled The Future Food Deal. And there are two parts of this initiative: visions, which are the drawings that you see hanging in the upper floor, where we invited academics and researchers from different institutions and offices to question what is the future of food and urbanity and what will it be like in 2050. So the invited participants were posed these questions and related issues, including food justice, species interdependencies, global political alliances, and obsolete infrastructures. These explorations were encouraged through visualizations, expressions of power dynamics, and questions like who gets to benefit from ecological catastrophe, who does not get to benefit, and what is the territory of the planet with these transformations in the near future.
The Future Food Deal also has a second section that is what we call the cookbooks. The Cookbooks Initiative was an open call that we did in order to explore, detect young talent and interesting project out there that can confront principles of kinship, of circularity, of localization, and they can actually create what we call cookbooks in the sense of guidelines, creating certain open source even solutions that people could eventually adapt to different contexts, extrapolate them, and implement them in different places in the world.
In correlation with the Tallinn Architecture Biennale, which has also become part of the catalog that you all have in your tote bags, is an eFlex architecture series called Digestion, which includes a series of texts by different authors that expand the context of the Biennale. And this was a collaboration, of course, with Nick Axel and Nicholas Hirsch from eFlex Architecture, and it includes texts that have already started being published. So if you haven't gotten a chance to read Mark Wigley's text on the excremental interior, it's online, it's an amazing text, read it. Other authors whose texts are still coming out include Audeline Dullier, Rachel Armstrong, Reef Larson, Mei-Ling Loco, Meredith Tenhur, Fei-Fei Zhu, and others.
In summing up our introduction, we wish actually to discuss 3 key points, 3 reflections that we want you also to reflect upon and take with you from Edible. The first one is the fragility of production and distribution processes. So food uncertainty, the impact of the pandemic on industrial food production, or events such as the current Russian war against Ukraine, or the energy crisis related to this, even the blockades of the Suez Canal in March 2021 that actually seized global transportation. It had an effect on the global economy, on the price of the oil. All these global events, they foreground the urgency for a united reflection on the fragility of our production and our distribution processes. They urge to start thinking the significance of the geolocation of these processes and the means, where do they happen, where does production, distribution, consumption is happening, and how, through which kind of means. And it also urges us to reflect on our exaggerated lifestyles, which are leading to a ceaseless growth model, to endless mobility needs, and finally, of course, reflect on our accountability on how we occupy the planet.
So the second point that we want to leave you with, which has become eminently important in the last few years, is the question of interspecies alliances. So what is interesting when we explore the material, societal, or geopolitical entanglements between architecture and food, we realize that these connections operate in different scales, from the micro scale and the cells of our bodies to the macro scale of the territorial ecologies. But that's not just, it's not just scale that becomes important here. Additionally, we're dealing with interdependencies between food, architecture, humans, as well as biological, cultural, and technological others. Moving beyond an understanding of metabolism as a collection of inhabitable machines, which, if we think about it, is the kind of heavy burden of modernism, we explore the notion of metabolism as patterns of energy and material generation and distribution within a multiverse, or within what Arturo Escobar, who is a philosopher and anthropologist, calls a pluriverse. This reality does not tolerate traditional dichotomies that have been sustained since the Enlightenment, dichotomies between what is nature and what is artifice, what is human and what is not human, what is resource and what is waste. Rather, it urges the emergence of a new network of life and death and alternative forms of matter within a web of life and death, including non-human agents.
The last point we want you to reflect upon is the paradigm of abundance versus the one of scarcity. You know, one fundamental mistake of the mainstream idea of sustainability, or at least the way that society perceives it, is the aspect that we need to compromise our needs and we need to compromise our desires. We are asked to consume less, to build less, to generate less emission, to move less, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, as we have already seen, the global systems in place, they operate in a totally different mindset, in a mindset which is very much focused in centralization, in extractive approaches, in heavy carbonized processes, or even in based on traditional dichotomies of separation between what is waste, what is valuable matter, what is interior and what is exterior. And we believe we need to ask more from architecture. We need to ask more from how our byproducts are being reused, from how and where our resources are generated in buildings and cities, and eventually to implement new forms of localization and a new paradigm that operates with an abundance mindset rather than from a place of scarcity. So operating with an abundance mindset is a new paradigm relevant to the practices of design and expands or helps to expand the definition of resources, as well as where resources can be found and how they can be used. And this allows us to think of cities or the built environment as potential mines from where we can actually mine resources that until now we were considering non-useful for us. So we want you to stay with this idea of abundance, following natural logics as well of what is scarce and what is abundant. And we want you to discuss with us during these 2 days all these ideas together. So welcome to Edible.
Welcome. On that note, we want to thank you for your attention, and we would like to talk to each and one of you with any questions that you have. So thank you to everybody again, and welcome to Edible.
Thank you.